Hello and welcome to On The Record. I'm your host, Jerome Sawyer. Rebuilding is underway in Abaco and Grand Bahama, and we seem to be on the way to restoration and some sense of normalcy. With no build zones now in effect, the Disaster Recovery Fund operational, and increased budget for restoration, there appears to be a flicker of light at the end of this dark tunnel. Or is there? September's monster storm Dorian wiped out parts of the infrastructure and left thousands displaced. And despite the yeoman's effort in the recovery, it still begs the question, could the worst still be ahead of us? Tonight, we discuss the fearful reality that has become our new norm. Living on the brink. Is the Bahamas just one disaster away from ruin? Tonight's panel, experts in analyzing the fiscal and structural soundness of our country. Stay tuned. Our discussion begins on the other side of this break. Welcome to On The Record.
Looking for more On The Record? If you miss our Thursday showing at 8 p.m., join us for the re-airing on Friday mornings at 10, and then again each Sunday night at 8:30. Or go to our YouTube channel and catch up on all of our past episodes. And then like our Facebook and Instagram pages for a preview of upcoming shows and get a chance to ask your questions. Just look for On The Record.
And welcome back to On The Record. I'm your host, Jerome Sawyer. As always, thanks for watching us. Shortly after the worst hurricane known to the Bahamas made landfall on Abaco and Grand Bahama, Prime Minister Minnis announced the creation of a new ministry focused on recovery, as well as the appointment of redevelopment coordinators to aid in ensuring those islands are built back better and bigger. Well, with tons of relief aid sent, a pledge conference hosted, and the implementation of the Disaster Relief Fund, it may give the impression that we are resilient, strong, and able to handle all of this. But what happens as of June 1st when the hurricane season reopens? What happens if an already burdened Abaco and Grand Bahama were to experience another catastrophic hurricane? And then what happens if the South is battered again? And of course, the big question, what happens if the hub of our economy, New Providence, doesn't escape the next big one? Well, we're hoping to answer some of those questions tonight. My guest, Gowan Bowe, he's a Group CFO, Fidelity Bank and Trust International Limited, and Zhivargo Laing, Executive Director of the University of the Bahamas' Government and Public Policy Institute, as well as a former minister in the Ingram administration. Gentlemen, welcome to On The Record.
Thank you.
We're going to talk about, in our next segment, an upcoming forum where you're going to speak to some of these issues and sort of why that's so important. But in order to put all of this in context, I want people to understand, begin to understand the vulnerability of our economy and our country. So let's talk a little bit about where we were pre-Dorian. What was our trajectory? What was the country looking like economically prior to September of last year?
Well, in a nutshell, we were experiencing, I would call it, modest growth. Mm-hmm. We were still in a fragile situation because unemployment remained high. Tourism was robustly growing along with other countries in the Caribbean, and so that was fueling some of the modest growth that we were having. So ours was a situation not ideal, but certainly better than we had seen in prior years. And Dorian would have put a good dent into what was a modest economic situation in the country.
And I would just add on to that we were starting to address what I'm going to say, some of the fundamental areas. We had headwinds, or hurricanes, if you will, in the form of other countries and their views and perceptions of us that we were already combating. And we were starting, if you will, to focus attention on that. And what Dorian has done is shown the need for a holistic plan, because there are always going to be unexpected developments. So if you ask the policymakers, and if you certainly ask the economy, we were trying to address things to take that modest growth into a sustainable growth pattern that would allow unemployment to come down, that would take us back to the days of prosperity that we, some of the older ones, remember. And then you had this event, and what it highlighted is, well, you can't sit there thinking that there aren't going to be unplanned events. You have to prepare yourselves, not to say that there's a crystal ball, you know, but you have to be in a position that when there's something that throws you off course, it doesn't completely derail you. It simply says that I can readjust my plans to accommodate, or if you will, address matters that come up. So I think that as a country, you know, we certainly had positive feelings, as Zhivargo said, going into it. We were seeing the signs that were leading to optimism. And I won't say that Dorian has taken that away. I think what Dorian has done is had a distraction, and more importantly, to your opening remarks, how are we going to ready ourselves for another event? It doesn't have to be a Dorian. It can be an economic calamity like we experienced, you know, 10, 12 years ago.
Let's talk about how far it set us back, or where it set us back. I mean, we see the destruction. We know what needs to be done. In essence, we've heard what the repair bill is. It's in the billions. But from an economic perspective, and I want us to talk to the ordinary Bahamians. You know, I'm going to work every day. I've got a family. I've got obligations. What does this all mean for me?
Well, I mean, you know, to the extent that you live in, say, New Providence, your life continues as per usual. I mean, you know, unless you lost your job, you still have your job, you're still going to work, you're still making money you make, etc. But the burden of the entire country has now been increased to the extent that the government that you rely upon and the government that you fund has now got to find new resources to take care of some of our brothers and sisters in other places.
And what does that burden mean for me?
Well, at the moment, it doesn't mean anything to you other than sometime in the future, the bill for the borrowing to deal with that situation will come upon you, either in the form of fees. Taxes to some extent, but it doesn't mean new taxes or increased taxes, but you're going to pay that bill. And so your children will also have to pay that bill. So there will not be an immediate extraction from me personally, but that burden will exist for us all over time.
And I think economically, it's what I say, economic isn't a science, right? It's an art, and it's an emotional topic in the sense that when you feel things are positive, it tends to have a self-perpetuating effect. And so when you look at Grand Bahama and Abaco, what is more important is to get the enthusiasm back. So as Zhivargo said, in New Providence, most persons wouldn't feel it. However, if their brothers and sisters in Grand Bahama and Abaco have this negative feeling, that's going to start to feel to the person who actually doesn't have an immediate shift. And that can become a self-perpetuating cycle. So if I'm sitting to the average man on the street, what I want to see is those developments that are going to lead me to believe that there is positive activity. So what does that mean? In Abaco and Grand Bahama, you know, with every adversity comes opportunity, right? And so from that perspective, it is saying, how do I get the money back into those economies? Not by virtue of saying, what is it that I spend, but how do I have the persons feeling that money in their pocket and circulating? You know, you have the long joke that talks about the shop owner that then goes and spends at the brothel, and the brothel then goes and spends at the liquor store, and the liquor store comes back to the shop owner. And that same $10, if you will, circulate. What is the impact of Dorian? It put that on pause in those two islands. And in New Providence, it then had an immediate one. Then how, as my brother's keeper, do I get aid to them? But there's only so far that my resources allow me to do. And I think then when we look at the central government, we have to stop with the view of what I'm going to call the numbers as if they don't have meaning to persons. We have to break the meaning of the numbers down to them. And as Zhivargo said, if we are borrowing, let's have the reality we have to pay it back. So there's no point in selling a dream that there will not be increased costs in order to fund it. And I totally agree. I may be different from him in this regard. To me, taxation should always be at the forefront of our minds because we are a financial services jurisdiction seeking to sell financial services. It is not about what we want as our tax system. It's about what is the appropriate tax system to fund what we need, but more importantly, allow us to continue to operate and sell financial services. So when we talk about paying the bill to the average man on the street, his concern is, yes, are my taxes going up? My switch to that would say to them, ideally, if you're paying 20 to 25% of your income in taxes, I don't expect you to pay any more, but it may be in a different form.
And this whole issue of taxation, to us, is still very new. I mean, let's be fair, a lot of the taxes that were in place prior to VAT, people didn't pay. You know, they're having a challenge right now trying to collect property tax. And, you know, we paid taxes, you know, at the border with our goods, etc. But VAT gave us a different reality. And I've asked this question numerous times on the show, and I've gotten varying answers, but had VAT not been in place and had it not been increased to the level that it is now, what kind of economic position would we have been in a post-Dorian era?
Well, there's two things here. We've always paid taxes. We've always paid relatively significant taxes.
But we never saw it as
never
that.
paid it directly. And that's the difference. Direct and indirect taxation. Ours has always been a dominant indirect taxation jurisdiction. So you kind of feel like, yeah, I paid it, but somewhere down the line.
Right.
VAT was in your face.
Yes.
Right?
On everything.
On everything. And so that's different. Like income tax is in your face. That comes out of your
But on
pay.
NIB and other things.
But even NIB is in your face, and that's why people felt NIB more.
Yes.
It's a direct form of taxation.
Right.
The businessman who pays business license taxes, it's in your face for him. But the thing about VAT is that if you did not have the VAT introduced and at the level that it's introduced now, it's not a question of what it would have meant for your economy, it's what it would have meant for the government's finances. And I think that's an important distinction to make. The economy and the government's finances are not the same thing. The government's financial operations is about 20% of this economy. 80% of the economy is the private sector. One could argue that not taxing at the level that we're taxing, we would have left more money in the economy for the private sector to do other things that could have benefited the economy. And so it's not an easy case to make that if we didn't have it, we would have been worse off, that if we had it, we would have been if we didn't have it, we would have been better off for the private sector. What we do know is the government certainly gets that additional revenue, and it makes the government better off from that point of view. In terms of the overall economy, that's a different discussion to have.
Yeah, and when we look at it, I think we realize when VAT was being introduced, the inefficiencies in the existing tax system. And so whilst value-added tax not only made it very apparent, certainly from the business perspective, to say this was a government levy, but it also improved the efficiency and effectiveness of the tax collection, which said those taxes that you referred to that largely went unpaid, this was one that had a very high compliance number in it. What it then says, and I think is absolutely right, the government manages those funds, because prior to having that increased revenue, there were certain deficit levels that either had to be funded by debt or were going to have to be funded by some form of fee and taxation. And so this was the chosen route. What is, I think, on the minds of most Bahamians is really, am I managing the additional resources in the most appropriate manner? Because it goes to the question, am I increasing my spending because I have more? So think of yourself as a normal human being. When you only had $100, you flew economy.
Yeah, you
right?
made do.
When you had $1,000,
you took lunch to work.
when you have $1,000, you want to see premium economy or business class.
Every day.
Right? And so, but you don't want to see government doing the same thing, because I think, and I would even extend Zhivargo's comment, because 80% is in the private sector, but the government also is, with that 20%, they are providing the social services, so our health, our law enforcement, our education, our national insurance program, and others that we are putting in there, right? The social services, etc. They're using the taxes. So let's be very clear. The government's purpose in taxing is to provide the social benefits that the country needs. So it's a little bit of a redistribution.
We don't always have that discussion. We're not very clear. We always ask, what is government doing with the money? Where are my tax dollars being spent?
I think you're absolutely right. You know, when the VAT was being introduced, I made a speech in Grand Bahama to the Rotary Club, and I said, you know, this issue of us getting less deficit because we're raising more revenue is really not accurate, because the truth of the matter is the government's revenue went from a little under $1 billion in 1992 to almost $2 billion by 2002, And that notwithstanding, we were still running deficits. And no new taxes were introduced at the time. The reason being is it's not how much revenue you make that determines whether you get a deficit or not. It's what you do with the revenue. And so one of the things I indicated was what we had to look at is what was the government's spending plan in light of this new revenue? We never got one. And so what we saw from VAT was introduced is we have seen burgeoning deficits, largely because you get sometimes with governments the wealth effect. I got more money, so
I could do these things.
I could do some more things.
Does it, and I've been asked, does it differ in administrations? Have we seen a difference? Do people feel more comfortable? Are they less comfortable since VAT was introduced versus even the increase now under this administration?
Well, I can't speak to feelings because people can have feelings born of their imagination, right? And imagination can lead you to hallucination sometimes. But we can look at the numbers. If you look at the Bahamas GFS deficit between 1993 and 1999, you would see that it averaged about 1%. That's pretty good. Right? Mm-hmm. And then
so explain to people what GFS
is. Yeah,
deficit.
GFS deficit is once you pay back some of your loan in lump sum, whatever you have left over in terms of spending above revenue, that's your deficit, okay? And because that's the thing that's going to impact your borrowing and your national debt. And so if you look at that over that period that I mentioned, it was fairly low. 1% is really low. Let me give you an example. What we're looking at now is 5-point-something% versus 1% on average over a almost 10-year period. Since that time, we have averaged 3% and gone up to as much as 5%. So what that meant is the rate of growth of your debt was accelerating, notwithstanding you were getting more money.
And I think the way you look at it and what the average man is saying is that ultimately we had some shocks that contributed to some of that.
Sure.
So when we had the economic recession, you'll hear a person say, well, the government stood in the gap, meaning that when the private sector withdrew or reduced its spending, the government spent more. Now, that would be perceived as, well, government started throwing money away, and that's not the case. Government started looking at where were the spending elements that we may have been deferring, that we're going to accelerate, because what we're trying to do is keep the economic momentum going. And it goes back to, as I said, as you feel, so it goes.
And there were things that government had to do in order to keep the economy going. There were things that they did.
Precisely. Well, think about the road projects, right? There was a big one that you know, my friend next to me. You don't want to forget it.
Talk about feeling. Right?
How could we forget?
Right. But now, when persons ride it, people happy that they have these smooth roads, right? But you also
and it gave people jobs. It did,
and that's what I'm saying. It allowed you.
But the important thing to remember was the only reason why we were able to respond to the recession the way we responded was because what had happened prior to that gave us what we call fiscal room to do it.
Do we have that now? Because we got to go to a break now. Do we have that now?
You have some.
Yeah,
we have some.
And we're still able to borrow.
Yeah,
so that shows you.
Okay, gentlemen, we are in the midst of what's going to be a very good discussion. Stay with us. On the Record continues right after this break.
Where in the world is Matt Lauer? Where in the world is Ellison Greenslade? And so these about the low value contingent in Atlanta. So we can talk about it.
On the Record tonight, the government's purchase of the Grand Botine is a hot subject in the news.
This portion of On the Record brought to you by Executive Printers of the Bahamas Limited. We print profits for you.
Welcome back to On the Record. I'm your host, Jerome Sawyer. This segment is brought to you by Executive Printers. As we continue our discussion tonight, we must take into account the vulnerability of our economy post-Dorian and other future natural disasters. As a small island developing state, the Bahamas faces its own fair share of sustainable development challenges, with natural disasters being one of them. Experts tell us there will be more hurricanes and maybe even more deadlier than Dorian. Helping us to discuss what steps we can do to mitigate the economic instabilities of these threats are my guests, Gowan. Bowe is the Group CFO of Fidelity Bank and Trust International Limited, and Zhivargo Laing, the Executive Director of the University of the Bahamas Government and Public Policy Institute, and a former minister. Gentlemen, you're also going to be participating in an upcoming forum Fidelity is putting on. I want us to talk about that and why that forum is so important to this discussion that we're having tonight.
Well, I think the best way of starting it, and we talked about it in the break, is expanding people's knowledge base. And the Royal Fidelity Bahamas Economic Outlook really, since its inception, has been designed to elevate the discussion to not only think about ourselves in an insular manner, thinking about the Bahamas alone, but understanding that actually, as a participant in the global economy, we need to understand all of the geopolitical events that are taking place. We need to have an understanding of what does the U.S.-China quote-unquote trade war mean? What does climate change, when the actual largest consuming countries, whether they adopt or don't adopt, what that means in terms of our overall impact with hurricanes and others. Because I think oftentimes, because of the standard of living that we have in the Bahamas, we believe that we exist unto ourselves. And so it's having that appreciation for, the reality is there is more that I'm going to say happening outside of the country that impacts us than what is happening inside. Because if events outside, we always say when the U.S. catches a cold, we catch pneumonia. The reality is if we don't have an appreciation of those events that are taking place around us, then we are even more vulnerable because we are blindsided when things happen and the effect starts to take place in the local economy.
You also, when we talk about economy, we're talking about all that buying and selling that takes place between people either in the country or people in the country and people outside the country. So all those transactions have to have an environment in which to operate, a physical environment in which to operate. If that physical environment is under threat, if that physical environment is being destabilized, all that buying and selling, all the buying cars, buying food, buying clothes, flying from here to go buy and shop in Walmart, all of that gets interrupted, and the quality and standard of living that you have gets impacted. So there's no way to not take account of climate change as a threat to our physical environment, storms as a threat to our physical environment, coronavirus as a threat to our health environment, because all of that means that the stability required to properly transact with other people, to buy and sell from and to other people, gets interrupted, and that's what's at stake for us all.
So when you sit down to discuss these matters, when you go into a forum like the Bahamas Economic Outlook, what kinds of things are you hoping to put on the table? And more importantly, what are people going to take away from this? Because it's one thing to get us in the room to talk. The conference can be great and, it can be a fantastic lineup of speakers. But what are you hoping for people to take away from this? And what action are you hoping will come as a result of this? I mean, as the show said, are we living on the brink? Are we just one disaster away from destruction?
I would say to you very simply, elevating the debate and discussion. Because oftentimes the conversations we have, I wouldn't even go down to say they're not intellectual. They're not even worthwhile conversations other than they are entertaining, because we get into the emotional dialogue about who hasn't done what and what should be done. When we have these types of forums, you're looking to bring speakers that have been in and around these matters. So you're looking at a person who is involved in climate change. You're looking at ambassadors and persons who've been in the industry and dealing with foreign trade relations. So that when we are starting to talk about how does the Bahamas interact with the EU and OECD, well, we are listening to persons who would have done similar negotiations, maybe not necessarily on tax policy, but on trade policy and others. So we're trying to, if you will, convey the message that the best way of elevating yourself is through elevating the discussion. And the best way of elevating the discussion is having persons who have some knowledge of the subject matter, but most importantly, that break it down in easier and common language, because it is not intended to be a philosophical debate amongst those in that sphere. It's intended to be an opportunity in a forum for the average person. So the lady that is caretaker of the home, who's taking care of a family, who's saying, you know what, my job is more difficult than the breadwinner who's going out, but I need to know what's happening, because when he's saving the money or not saving the money, when he's investing for the family or not investing for the family, is he taking into consideration all the events that are around? And so I'll tell you that some of the persons who are most eager to do so are those who are saying, well, I want to understand what it is that I don't know. So I don't know what I don't know. So if I come to a forum that actually starts talking about things that are far more elevated than what I'm going to say, the nonsensical discussions we have at times. And that's not to insult, it's entertainment value. But if we move beyond that, then we have a better dialogue.
Do we waste a lot of time in the emotional discussions, in the entertainment discussions, as opposed to telling our people how to prepare? Because let's face it, if the next hurricane came to Nassau, how many of us would be able to survive off of what we have, or have a plan in place, or are resilient enough to recover?
You know, one of the things that's true is we can't judge the impact of all the information that's been spread in the world, because you don't know how things are affecting people in their private lives and what they're doing to execute on the information they got in their private lives. The best thing you can do is be the sower of seeds. I tell people, if you look at the parable of the sower, the least amount of information you know about the sower, who's his name, where did he go to school, and the seed. Why is that? Because it's irrelevant. I'm sowing seed. I'm sowing information that is useful and helpful and elevated to a point of helping people understand. What they do with it, that's the soil business. I can't get in that. But what we do know is large numbers of people take information and translate it into action for their lives. And so you go into a meeting like this, you hear people say, listen, we have to be cognizant of climate change. We're not having a debate anymore about whether it's happening. We're having a debate about what you do in light thereof. And so what does that mean for you personally? That means you need to make your own personal finances more resilient. So that means you have to control the way you take in and spend. You have to do things around, you try to get in a place where you can be insured, that kind of thing. So people will walk out of there saying, you know what, I've heard enough, it's been clear enough, it's been emphasized enough, and now I'm going to take the action I need to take.
That's the important word you use, action. I think far too often there is inaction, or we think, this doesn't really affect me.
But it's changing now, you know, because I think it's becoming so real. Like before, we used to see hurricanes, you know, there used to be a huge inaction. Now, if the wind blow a little too hard, people looking for where the shutters are, right? So we started that, I'm going to say, physical preparation. To your point, in terms of the financial preparation, what we've lived by, I'm going to say, we've always considered ourselves a Christian nation, and God will take care of us. And so
he can push the storm away.
or when something bad happens, he can find a way.
Yeah.
Not realizing that God helps those who help themselves. And so it is more about saying, well, okay, how do you start doing little things? How do you start looking at the revenues you have and how you're expending? Same way we are asking for the accountability from government, and that's why society and government is just a microcosm of society. That the indiscipline we sometimes see in the way government behaves, or we perceive the way government behaves, is really just a reflection of how we are. If we want government to change and we're saying, I know I make $10,000 a year, and I know that I spend $1,500 a year in Starbucks coffee, does that make sense? Versus when I have the $10,000 a year, yes, I can debate whether that's a livable wage, as we use this term so often, but if I am redirecting the resources, when I think of our forefathers, grandparents and those, I don't actually know what it was they earned. I know that their spending was where it was most needed. And the luxury, or what I'm going to say, the frivolous items for our gratification came at the end. My grandmother would make one soda, spread around 7 or 8 of us as cousins, because that big block of ice, that big block of ice in the cup.
We've got to go quickly. 2 very, very quick points. Do we need to take more individual responsibility for our lives and being prepared. That's one. And then I just want to tell people where they can come and experience the business.
Without question. There's no question that the greatest resiliency that you can do is the resiliency you do for yourself. Let me give you an example, a quick example of one thing. How about you have an open ticket to travel just in the event you might have to evacuate the place you are? You keep the ticket open. You could have it to another island, you could have it to the States, just because I may have to leave quickly. How about saving for that possibility? That makes you more resilient.
Okay. And then, of course, Bahamas Economic Outlook.
March 4th, Bahama. And the website, don't quote me, I'm sure you'll do it later on, but certainly the RoyalFidelityBEO.com, but certainly ensuring that you sign up for it, because like I said, it's a fun day, information, and then elevate into the day.
Sounds good. Bahamas Economic Outlook. Certainly a good place for you to begin to think about how you're going to come back from the next big disaster, because, folks, it's going to happen. Most definitely. Gentlemen, thank you very much. Thank you for coming on. And best of luck to you in the upcoming Outlook. When we come back, I'm going to be joined by the first professionally licensed Bahamian to specialize in coastal engineering. He's going to tell us whether structurally we're able to withstand the next big one. Stay with us. Our show continues. Watching On The Record, I'm your host, Jerome Sawyer. With reconstruction on the way in Grand Bahama and Abaco, one of the main concerns is how do we build to ensure this doesn't happen again? And for the wider Bahamas, this is something we must all consider. My guest is now the first professionally licensed Bahamian to specialize in coastal engineering, Mr. Carlos Palacious, Managing Principal of BRON International. Thank you for being on the record.
Thank you.
The first half of the show, we talked about the economic soundness and how do we prepare and what things we do. This part of the show, we're going to talk about best practices in trying to make sure that we are structurally sound. What kind of infrastructure does our topography allow for? We're in a hurricane zone. We, for the most part, are in coastal communities. We're low-lying. What should we look like from a structural perspective?
Sure, Jerome. Thank you very much for having me again. It's always a pleasure. And thank you for all the work that you've been doing, of course, and in spreading the positive side of what we can get done. And I would say that obviously we all know we're in the top 10 in the world. Abaco, Grand Bahama, and Eleuthera are actually 3 of the top 10 most impacted sites in the entire world for Atlantic Basin hurricanes, which is obviously what we experience. So we've known that from basically from the beginning of our existence. And we can see the historical rebuilds that we've had. We've learned some lessons, and we've come up with a robust way of building. We build in a traditional way, which is block and tie column is what we call it. So you have your concrete columns and you have your block infill. And we've been doing this for a while, and it's led actually to a number of other countries following some of our best practices. And what we're seeing now from a professional standpoint is a new chapter in our existence. And when you look at people in general, we've been on the earth for millions of years, and every 11 to 20,000 years or so, we go into an ice age. Every 11 to 20,000, and that's the last time approximately we had one. And that's what we're going into. And the climate change has helped, obviously, from a human standpoint, to speed that up. But what that means is we are seeing very extreme amounts of weather fluctuations. We see that from the fires in Australia. Some obviously were arson, but others are natural. We're seeing droughts in parts of the world that wouldn't have traditionally had them. We're seeing major rain events. And for us, we're seeing these massive hurricanes. And we're also seeing bigger winter storms. These big nor'easter events that, if you drive along Western New Providence, you see all the sand in the road. And you say, why is all the sand in the road? It's not a hurricane. You look out, it looks a little choppy.
It's wintertime.
It's major frontal systems that are more extreme than we've had. So how do we build to now prepare us for the future? luckily our firm and our group of companies have been able to do extensive research in the Caribbean, actually. We've consulted to 8 Caribbean countries on their climate change and resiliency policies. We also wrote the climate policy for the Bahamas that's now being instituted with some of these projects. And some of the underlying data that we've found from best practices in Barbados and Jamaica and Trinidad and everywhere who goes through what we go through is elevation is key. Now, our topography, we're low-lying, one of the lowest countries in the region. Average elevation, 3 to 5 feet above sea level. What that means then is we have to be intentional on where and how we build. We will have to establish, and our policymakers have committed to it, certain restrictive covenants. So right now we have a blanket building code. It applies the same no matter where you're building in the Bahamas. If you're building in a low-lying lot in South Beach, or if you're building on top of East Street or Blue Hill, it's the exact same code. Obviously, you can imagine building 4 or 5 feet above sea level in an area where you know you'll get 6 to 10 feet of flooding is not going to prepare us for the future. Elevation, building materials, best practices in terms of making sure that we batten down, that we use proper hurricane-rated different types of windows and doors and those types of things. And then, of course, shifting the culture on how we can be better prepared. And we can talk about more on that.
Historically, we lived in coastal communities because we started out as fishing villages. We lived from the sea. Our transportation was the sea. So our communities historically are coastal. So you have all of these communities that were established that continue to thrive. We see what happens to them now. Or do we now need to really move to enforce these no-build zone policies that government is talking about?
We have to have no-build. Certain critical areas, and there's a process to get to that. It's not...
Because that's the concern, you know.
Exactly.
People say, mama house on the beach, we lived there all our lives. You talk about no-build.
It's a process to get to that, right? And so how do we look at the best practices of our neighbors and then implement what fits for us, right? Because it's not a matter of just laying out the country and drawing a line. It's a matter of making data-driven decisions. So we at Caribbean Coastal Services, for example, our coastal engineering company, we can do modeling that can actually map all of the hazards, all of the low-lying areas, and that can be both from an environmental standpoint, because remember, we have to protect our coral reefs. We have to protect our wetlands. These are the nature's buffers that help to prepare us and protect us when these storms come, right? So how do we make sure that we are protecting and preserving our natural environment? And at the same time, how do we make sure that we're following best practices as we start to rebuild? And in a tangible way, that's understanding based on this scenario or that scenario, a hurricane out of this direction or that direction, you can expect, let's say, a flood condition of 10 feet. So if I now know that, and I am in a susceptible area, then as a policymaker, I have a decision. Either I can allow people to, let's say, build non-habitable structures. You could have a gazebo, some type of cottage, you know, something that's, let's say, a lower occupancy rating. But should a 5-bedroom home be there with families, etc., then we have to understand the risk and the exposure. And that can be scientifically done. We do it now, and it has to be a part of our planning moving forward.
Those homes and those people who already live there, who are in those communities that are susceptible to the flooding and to the major damage, what happens to them? I mean, when you say to yourself, hey, I've been in a family home 30 years, this is all I have. But I know that I am, if I can use in the line of fire now, you know, from a hurricane. Is there anything that can be done to existing structures?
Yeah, retrofitting is one thing. I always speak, and when I talk about to persons, I say, listen, everybody should at least know the basic status of where they live. It's as critical as knowing your body, right? You're not a doctor, I'm not a doctor, but I know I feel some pain. I know I see a little something on my arm that wasn't there before. I feel a lump that something's off, right? And so you know that there's certain things that you have to do to maintain your body. Otherwise, you know, there'll be dire circumstances. And it's the same thing with our homes. You know, we see the little drip on our sheetrock. That means water's coming in after a major rain. That means a piece of plywood or something like that might be soft. And your structure is only as strong as the weakest component. That one little soft spot where up on your roof, the piece of plywood might have rotted for the last few years, needs to be replaced. Because when a storm comes, that's what blows out, your roof comes off. You see, so oftentimes we have the indicators, but it's on us to be responsible. Once again, bring in a licensed architect or engineer or contractor and let them take a look at it. So people who have existing homes, as I do, need to make sure that you're doing your due diligence, your basic due diligence. Can you just shut down our communities and everybody build up on top of East Street Hill? No, we know that's not practical. But what we can understand is when there are things like mandatory evacuations, when there are things like knowing where your nearest hurricane shelter is, how will you get there? Making sure that the infrastructure to get there is high enough so that if you have to leave, or etc., you can, is a part of how we can prepare.
Mm-hmm. A lot of people, young people, looking to build new homes. You're starting out with a family, don't have a lot of money. Sometimes you take what you can get. Mm-hmm. As you are looking now to move into a home or to build, as a layperson, I don't know what to ask. I just know, hey, these plans look good, I can afford this. But what things can you do individually when you go into the construction phase, when you're looking at, an architect lays out some plans, you're looking at property, what kinds of things do you need to start considering to become the responsible homeowner, not to build where or in a way that's going to put you in harm's way?
Sure, and that's a brilliant question. I would say that it is important to know where you're moving in under various conditions. Mm-hmm. So we all know when we have a major rain event, right? And downtown's all flooded, for example, right? So after a major rain event, drive to the community that you want to live in and look around. Because I can guarantee you that whatever condition you see then would be multiplied many times over. It's not going to get better. It's not going to get better. Yeah. So if, for example, you were looking at this nice lot and it was a great deal and the realtors tell you it's a perfect location,
I can afford that.
And you could afford that and you got your financing, etc. And all I say to persons when we consult to them is, it's important for you to be aware. We're not saying just pack it all up and we need, like I said, but just be aware of what you're getting yourself into, so that you're prepared and you and your family, because no one likes surprises, right? So if you go visit the lot and you see, okay, there's 8 inches to a foot of water, then be aware of that. If you look on the back part of your lot and clearly the contractor just filled in some what we call swamp or wetlands, and there's wetlands all around, Mother Nature will always want to send the water to the lowest point. And if you're at the lowest point, then you're probably going to have that. So that type of due diligence is just basic. It's just basic type of due diligence.
Do you then say to the contractor that, hey, I noticed a level of flooding here. I think we need to reevaluate. I probably need a higher foundation. Yes. I need to go up. Are these, because sometimes, and I can tell you, having gone through it, sometimes you feel, well, this guy is building, he should know. How much input do I really need to have?
And that's where, once again, it's always to follow your gut and to follow best practices. And what I love about, let's say, our generation and the way the world is, we become experts in anything we want to Google, And you can find information is available. So before, a doctor knows everything because they went to school for 15 years. A contractor knows everything because they've been doing it for all of these years. But right now, you can Google. You can just simply Google how to prepare my home for a hurricane, what to look for when buying property based on climate change. Just those types of things, right? And just read up. And obviously there's fake news around, but you can, differentiate. So I encourage everybody to access information. Because if anything, and you need to trust the professionals who do it for a living, but if anything, it arms you with the questions to ask.
What about those folks who are on the coast right now? I mean, like I said earlier, you've got a home, you live there. Once June hits again, we all go into that nervous mode, I call it. But when you're living or you have property on the coastline, you live in a coastal community, what are the things you need to consider outright?
So obviously there's 2 major factors when you're talking about coastal living, right? It's wind and it's water, right? Wind is easier to prepare for than water is.
Really?
Yeah, much by far. And most damage comes from flooding and flooding related effects. That's from disease, etc. Most things are water related. Okay. So wind is easier to prepare for. We can best, as let's say engineers, design to have you under the condition where you will be sustained through wind conditions. But water is a very dangerous thing. And so once again, and the best way to determine the future is to look at the past events. So once again, if you've had some flooding, if during king tides, which have become a major discussion point in recent times, are happening and you have water near your doorstep, then you know you need your sandbags. You have to be ready. You probably need to evacuate. I always recommend when persons are remodeling their homes to make the lower floor, especially if you're on the coast, what we call flood or water resistant. So that means your electrical outlets are higher up. That means that there's a way potentially to turn breakers off in certain parts of your home that could become compromised. That means to segment your home. Let's say if you're remodeling the inside, where if you have a breach, you could then compartmentalize the pressure, and a professional can help you with that. So there are things that can be done. But once again, it's ingraining in our culture and our people, where when persons, for example, who live on the side of volcanoes, they know. They know they have the alarm, early warning systems. Everybody in the entire community and country knows when they hear that alarm, whatever you're doing, you drop it, you break off running, you know where you go. When you are in tornado environments, you know when you hear that alarm rings, you go, you stand. So we have to prepare for hurricanes in the same way.
We've got to take a break, and hopefully this last experience will put us more into a serious preparation mode. Because I think as my guest has said, we've been for so long relying on, we're going to be okay. Stay with us. Our discussion continues into our final segment right after this. Hello and welcome to On The Record, a debate-style television talk show where Bahamians will find the balanced, true, and open debate they've been looking for.
And the icon goes to On The Record.
On The Record was born out of a desire to do something different. What we do every day helps our country, it helps our society, it helps to shape the views and opinions.
Listen, what is more dangerous?
Gentlemen, we've got to move very quickly. Let's wrap up. It's all On The Record. I'm your host, Jerome Sawyer. Our discussion begins on the other side of this break. Watching On The Record. This is our final segment tonight. We continue our conversation with my guest. He's a coastal engineer, Mr. Carlos Palacious, the managing principal with BRON International. We are still very much so in the preliminary stages of, or even the infancy stages of the rebuild in Abaco and Grand Bahama. I want to talk broadly, like what things do we need to focus on now? I mean, I know there's a lot of talk and even some effort in terms of the domes in trying to get people just into temporary housing to get them, out of shelters, out of New Providence, or out of family homes and into some semblance of, of accommodations. But what should the broader discussion be and the broader view look like? Because we're going to rebuild.
Yes. Yeah. So right now, Jerome, we're in the restoration phase, right. Which is significantly doing waste removal, repurposing, etc., trying to restore what was there before, which is a basic semblance of, having proper roads, having infrastructure in place, etc., and having people's basic needs met. So trying to get, food stores and community centers and churches and schools back up and running. The next chapter after the restoration would be rebuilding. Which then means, obviously, we now have to push to make sure the commerce can go, which will drive the jobs, which we can now drive, the residential side of rebuilding. And about 90% of all the damage was to the private sector. And a large percentage of that, unfortunately, was uninsured. And unfortunately, from my understanding of reports, a lot will be uninsurable. So that means that we have to plan intentionally of how we probably have public-private partnerships to help us restructure the way we approach the rebuilding process. Obviously, the critical part of being insurable from a coastal or an engineering standpoint is how are we laying out our communities? Where are we laying out our communities? Making sure that once we are putting in our infrastructure, for example, our utilities, our electricity, etc., is probably run underground. We're following best practices so that for future events, we are better prepared. The key word is mitigation. There's a cost to mitigation. And what that basically means is we have an opportunity right now to invest in our future, to invest, to spend some now so that the next Dorian that comes, when it does, we will be able to rejuvenate ourselves sooner.
When you look at a Grand Bahama and the airport in Grand Bahama, which I think this is probably the third time that airport has been severely damaged and impacted. When you look at that, and the discussion has already begun as to, do we relocate? It sounds good. It seems really practical, but that's a huge undertaking. And then where do you relocate to?
It is. It's a major challenge. And so we've looked at various options for Grand Bahama. And, you know, a part of it, let's say from a land use planning standpoint, is that airports, as you know, due to air traffic and noise and things like that, need to often be located outside of the major economic hub of your city. You know, nobody wants to live under planes flying directly over them. That's a fact. So how can we do some best practice steps? For example, other countries have built levees and berms, etc., and the Netherlands are a prime example of how they utilize that. And so what we've tried to push from a private sector standpoint is repurposing our what we call hurricane waste. So we have a lot of concrete and a lot of debris. And what that can actually be done, with that is it can be crushed. And we've done tours of the Grand Bahama landfill, etc. We've had meetings with the port. That can be repurposed to help to create more resilient infrastructure and to help to protect our infrastructure. So repurposing what the hurricane has left behind could allow us to potentially protect certain critical infrastructures like our airports by putting, like I said, in place certain surge, flood, and levee walls and earthen structures that could help to mitigate.
Well, we have not talked about other levees and walls. I mean, we talk about moving and going up, but, you know, is it practical to put barriers in place? And when you consider the Katrina New Orleans experience where the levees didn't even hold under those conditions, but, you know, is that a viable option that we should be looking into?
So a critical part of what we call disaster risk management and planning is the key to a structure, essentially, is to give you enough time to get out. That is the critical thing. So can it at least preserve, let's say if your window is compromised or the flood wall is compromised, does it give people enough chance to get out? If it doesn't, we need to figure out how to do that. We can't promise the next Dorian will come and all the houses will be built to code and everything will be static. That's not the reality of life. But can we at least make sure persons in critical areas have evacuated? That persons who have, let's say, had certain structural breaches in their areas can at least get to higher ground or safer ground. When we rebuild the community centers and the flood shelters, are we making sure that the generator is built above the floodplain? Because we can have 300 people in it, but if the generator is built on grade and it fails, then now everyone in the shelter is compromised. So there are ways we can do it in terms of levies, etc., and best practices. It gets more expensive, of course, but it's understanding the risk and the hazards and the priorities in planning our communities.
Do we need to give more consideration to what we determine to be a shelter? I have found and I have seen some instances where shelters are used because they're big buildings or because they can hold lots of people, or, you know, it's a little setback from everyone else. But do we need to put in some stringent measures for our shelters? I'm not quite sure how they're chosen now. I mean, sometimes I see the signs that say this is the shelter. But a lot of times I hear shelters, you know, I end up being read off on the news and I think to myself, is that really, really sound? And, you know, you look at the Abaco experience where shelters were compromised, you know, so do we need to look at that now from a holistic perspective and be a lot more deliberate
Yes.
in what we do with our shelters.
Oh, definitely, definitely. And, you know, part of the program would be, one, how do we identify what becomes a shelter?
And not just because it's a church.
What level of code compliance is required, and making sure that these structures can be upgraded and retrofitted to future shelters, right? To future design conditions. Because, you know, you build a shelter now, let's say, you're not going to knock it down and rebuild it every time the code gets updated, for example, right? So it can be retrofitted to future conditions, as well as the regular inspections are done, right? And a part of it is we're challenged. We know it. We're a small island developing state. We need to focus on education. We need to focus on safety. There are many priorities that we have to focus on. But what we've now discovered in the last 5 years as a people and as a region is these things that we call hurricanes have probably the largest single impact on our entire country at any given time. And that alone means it warrants spending money and focusing on it. The IDB projected that starting from 2025, it will cost the Bahamas about $500 million a year on climate-related impacts. $500 million a year from 2025 onward. That is a massive amount of money that nowhere currently sits in our budget, but an amount of money that we will have to come up with. Because it's not a choice if we can rebuild and provide shelter and protect our people. It's not a choice, it's a necessity. And that's why it's a time to be intentional on how we plan and how we focus for our future.
One of my final questions has to do with some of our keys. You know, we always talk about 700. The Bahamas is a place of 700 islands and keys.
And 2,500 keys.
Yeah.
We have 2,500 keys approximately.
Wow. Should we, again, look a lot closer at where we allow people to build on these keys? Because it's beautiful to say I have, you know, a private key or, you know, there are only a few people. They're beautiful and they create these wonderful experiences. But during a hurricane, they become a major hazard, particularly when people decide they're not going to move.
And that's a part of what we talked about earlier with the mandatory evacuations. You just have to have it, which I think is in place now. And it's not necessarily so much where, but what conditions are you allowed to build to? So, for example, you could be on a private key, and you could be safer than the persons who are in one of those church shelters we talked about, where the roof blows off, because you built to the certain codes and standards. So I'll give an example. We have an office in Florida. There's something in Florida called the CCCL, which stands for Coastal Construction Control Line. That is basically a line that's drawn around the entire state. If you live seaward of that line, there are certain conditions and rules you have to follow. If you want or can afford to build seaward of that line, then you have to meet certain elevation standards. You have to meet certain building permit standards. You have to have certain specialty inspectors who approve your structure to be built, let's call it, in a high-risk coastal area. So, can we put those types of measures in place? Absolutely. So it's not a one-size-fit-all. Oh, just write off, you know, no, we shouldn't be building.
We should have this building code for every area.
No, it is geographic specific, and geographic is also domestic within our own country.
Carlos, I think that's a perfect way to end, and it puts into context what we need to be doing. You know, obviously, these building codes that we've been so proud of for so long, not that they aren't relevant. I think, you know, we need to look at where we implement them. We need to put some rules in place to protect our people, you know, from the next big one. It's gonna happen.
Absolutely.
And it doesn't even necessarily have to be a hurricane, you know, the way that climate change is going. Thank you so very much for coming in and sharing with us. I think one of the things that I'm hoping that Hurricane Dorian has done to us as a people made us more aware and to stop and think and consider how we prepare. The only defense you have in a hurricane is good preparation. Thank you very much for coming on and sharing with us tonight. We thank you so much for watching this episode. Be sure and stay tuned as we continue to bring great guests and great topics. Special thanks to my guests, Zhivargo Laing, Gowan, Bowe, and Carlos Palacious. Also, thank you to my technical team for certainly answering the call and making making sure that the show is as great as it is every week. So thank you so much for tuning in. We'll see you next time, same place, same time.